once were, with hereditary chiefs and piles of yams, and more concerned with such things as state bureaucracies, taxation, and programs of social assistance. But I would suggest that a key anthropological insight remains of relevance, that distribution is a crucial social activity that is constitutive of the social and not only of the economic order. Accordingly, we need to pay attention to the idea of distribution as a necessary and valuable social activity. In this spirit, I will present here a brief discussion with some ethnographic illustrations of what I call distributive labor. To appreciate the way that distribution can be the object of labor, I will suggest, we must be prepared to sever what has become an unthinking and dogmatic coupling of the concept of labor with the concept of production. If we can do this, we will be able to arrive at new understandings, both of labor and also perhaps the problem of distribution. The current crisis, for many observers, directly recalls the Great Depression of the 1930s. And the responses to the crisis that have emerged in the last 2 years have sometimes seemed to participate in this apparent time warp. Keynesian ideas of fiscal stimulus and pump priming, long out of fashion with academic economists and policymakers alike, were quickly dusted off and pressed into service, if only because the dominant neoclassical orthodoxy hardly knew what to say about the crisis, except that it should not, according to theory, have happened. Keynes, of course, identified the great crisis of the 1930s as fundamentally a problem under consumption. Free markets did not, as classical theory taught, inevitably yield a rational optimization of the economic factors of production, but could rather lead to a suboptimum equilibrium, within which labor was far from fully employed, and the economy failed to produce and consume goods at the rate at which it was capable. The solution for Keynes was state intervention to stimulate demand, and thereby to restore both the productive power of the economy and the full employment of unemployed labor. The policies that grew up around the Keynesian turn not only required a strong state role in stimulating aggregate demand, but also called for measures to bring about a new distribution of income. This reshuffling of the economic cards, a New Deal, as it was termed in the United States, was logical in Keynesian terms, since shifting purchasing power to the less well-off, who could be expected to spend far more of their income than the wealthy, would be a direct means of creating badly needed consumption. How was such a new distribution to be accomplished? Two methods were central. First, the use of legal measures to boost wages, both by direct regulation, such as minimum wage laws, and the enhancement of the ability of labor to organize and press wage demands. In the United States, for instance, something called the Wagner Act fundamentally shifted the balance of power between labor and capital in labor's favor. Second, the creation of the various forms of social insurance and social assistance that came to be known under the rubric the welfare state. And it was the Depression that gave a real impetus to the development of these institutions. Both were based on a triangular relation linking the state, capital, and labor. Indeed, as David Harvey has argued, it is possible to understand the political resolution of the post-war years as entailing a kind of tripartite pact between capital and organized labor, brokered and managed by the state. Central to this pact was the idea that the fundamental societal problem of distribution could be addressed by altering the division of the distributional pie between capital and labor. The current crisis, too, has been widely diagnosed as requiring massive state intervention to stimulate demand. And many have suggested that a durable solution to it will also require another distributional shift from capital to labor, correcting in some measure the unprecedented levels of income inequality that the last 3 decades of neoliberal orthodoxy have produced. Now, I don't presume to be qualified to judge whether such a Keynesian or social democratic solution to the present crisis in the advanced industrial economies is either necessary or possible. But I do want to point out that in much of the rest of the world, and especially in Africa, an approach to distribution that fails to go beyond capital and wage labor cannot begin to address the most fundamental distributive needs. For in most of Africa, wage laborers, in the normal sense of the term, make up only a small percentage of the population. Zambia, for instance, is one of the most urbanized countries on the continent, with a population of some 12 million people. But in 2005, only 400,000 Zambians were employed in what is known as the formal sector, a wage labor participation rate of fewer than 8% of its adult population. Even in South Africa, by far the most industrialized and proletarianized country in the region, unemployment runs at some 35 to 40% of the working age population. And the figure is substantially higher still in the poorest and blackest parts of the country. Now, it used to be common to assume that the great mass of Africans who did not participate in the wage labor market were agriculturalists. But that is plainly no longer the case in many African countries. Instead, vast and increasing numbers of people live in urban areas, but without either access to land or any stable or regularized employment. This situation has been effectively, if rather sensationalistically, depicted in Mike Davis's recent book, Planet of Slums. In much of the world, the normal urban existence is today not based on wage labor, but on hustling, scavenging, and improvising. Selling a bit of this, stealing a bit of that, borrowing from friends, relying on the kindness of kin, and opportunistically seizing unexpected chances when they arise. There have always been such people among the urban poor, of course, and not only in Africa. Colonial planners knew them as what they called loafers, hangers-on. Marx famously identified them as the lumpen proletariat. Contemporary observers of Africa speak of the youth, even as they recognize that many of the youth are in their 40s and 50s. In the past, this social stratum was often understood as marginal, residual, or a passing phenomenon of transition. Such understandings are no longer plausible. In many African cities, people lacking both land and formal sector jobs make up the majority of the population, and the proportion is by most accounts growing. Their livelihoods are often described in terms of a so-called informal sector or informal economy. But ethnographic research suggests that the more fundamental characteristic of most such livelihoods is that they're almost unbelievably precarious and insecure, and that those who navigate them manage to avoid the worst only through a continual process of flexible improvisation. The combination of precariousness and flexibility is not well captured by the term informal, and I therefore prefer to refer to the fundamental dynamic as one of survivalist improvisation. The term is inspired by the vernacular usage in Zambia and elsewhere on the continent that provides the usual response to questions about how someone is faring. If you ask someone, how are you doing, they will say, I'm just surviving. Any meaningful approach to the problem of distribution in Africa must be able to understand these precarious livelihoods and to include in any distributive remedy the huge populations who depend on them. In reading the social scientific and policy literature, I have been struck by what seems to me a persistent misrecognition of these forms of livelihood, a misrecognition that I term productionist. This misrecognition takes several different forms. On the right, the attempt is to see urban improvisatory survivalists as micro-entrepreneurs. If not actually capitalists in miniature, then at least self-employed businessmen and businesswomen, or proprietors of, as the phrase has it, small, medium, and micro enterprises. On the left, the urge is to see the same people as workers, implicitly sharing a class position, and potentially the politics, with the wage-earning proletariat. The policies and politics that such visions inspire are varied and ideologically opposed. ranging from Hernando de Soto-inspired proposals to make capitalists out of the poorest shack dwellers by titling their shacks, to labor right projects to organize petty commodity producers into labor unions. Such projects are a diverse lot, and some may have their uses in specific situations. But they seem to have in common a sense of being a bit out of touch with the actual realities of survivalist improvisation, since they so often start not with what people are or can reasonably hope to be, but with productionist ideas of what they ought to be, but inexplicably are not. That is, proper business owners or properly organized workers. The more optimistic accounts see in the so-called informal economy not only an inert reservoir of poverty, but a vast potential for creating jobs, as they say. I come to such accounts with a considerable fund of skepticism, deriving from my experience on the Zambian copper belt. There, a disastrous downturn in the mining industry produced massive unemployment. Former mine workers, who had enjoyed relatively well-paid, secure employment, were reduced to trying to make out a living on the streets. One man I knew, for instance, tried to survive by buying each day a pack of cigarettes, and then standing on a street corner trying to sell them one by one to passers-by. As I was observing such things, a celebratory policy literature was praising the informal economy for its ability to create jobs at an unprecedented rate. One had to wonder if putting a mine worker on a street corner selling cigarettes was creating a job, what did losing a job look like? A second scene from the copper belt is perhaps equally telling. On a certain street corner that I knew well, two women were in the habit of sitting and selling vegetables, mainly tomatoes and onions. By the time I completed my research, the same corner had at least 10 women selling the same limited set of goods to the same limited set of passers-by. What boosters of the virtues of the informal might describe as an impressive expansion of employment, 10 small business owners instead of 2, was on inspection something quite different. For the fundamental dynamic here was not one of creating new services or tapping new markets, but of splitting an already small market into ever smaller slivers, raising the denominator, in effect, below a more or less constant numerator. A great deal of what counts as informal activity, recent research shows, is fundamentally fractional in this sense, less about creating new goods and services than about raising the denominator in a distributional process. A good part of such activity, too, involves ways in which people who do not have access to wage labor endeavor to capture a piece of the wages earned by those who do. This is one of a number of reasons why it's misleading to speak of a second economy, as if it were separate from the first. It's also one of the reasons why it's misleading to simply merge improvisatory survivalists with workers, as if they form the single class. Many of those who emphasize the productive element in informal improvisatory labor, of course, do so in order to defend the moral and economic virtue of the urban poor. The improvisers are not idle, they point out, but in fact highly productive. Therefore, it is implied they deserve our respect and help, not our disdain. Modern ideas of democratic citizenship have long relied on the dignity of wage labor as a kind of moral credential, authorizing social and political membership. Where large proportions of the population are left out of the world of wage labor, as they are in most African cities and in many other places as well, it is understandable that those who would make claims for social inclusion and membership should be eager to argue that the urban poor are in fact highly productive workers, and that we would see this if only we would look a little more closely. Now, work in the so-called informal sector, even at the lower survivalist end of it, is indeed usually productive in an economic sense, just as it is often integrated with or functional to the celebrated productivity of the so-called first economy. My point, however, is that even where it isn't, there is no cause for disdain, and no reason to ignore the fact that even the unproductive are both engaged in labor and entitled to social membership. The woman begging on the street may not be producing a good or selling a service, but she works all day. To say that she's not productive is not to denigrate her labor. It is instead to underline the importance and value of distribution. The current crisis reminds us that distribution is a key task, maybe even the key task, facing human societies today. The levels of production of which we are capable today are absolutely astonishing, and we have the capacity to produce far more than any of us need. Distribution is the challenge of our era. And it is a challenge that goes far beyond the distributionist remedies devised for earlier economic periods. For a new global politics of distribution today must be centrally concerned not simply with labor, as conventionally understood, but with the people I have here termed improvisers. In this perspective, it is significant that a great deal of what the improvisers actually do in a day-to-day way, in fact, has as much to do with distribution as with production. I emphasize that this is not a matter of a merely quantitative process of income distribution, but rather involves, just as production does, a set of social relations, social institutions, and social processes. The concept I propose for grasping this key fact is distributive labor. Consider the following 4 examples of survivalist improvisatory labor, examples which one might easily observe in any African city today. The first example is the windshield washer. This is the guy who comes out when your car is stopped at a red light and sloshes some dirty water on your windshield, rubs it around, and hopes that before you drive away, maybe you'll give him a coin or 2. The second example is the panhandler. Stands in the street, asks for money. Familiar enough. The third example is the pickpocket. Stands in the street, doesn't ask. The fourth example, a loving mother from an impoverished rural area who comes to visit her employed son in the city, explaining to him the problems and hardships of people back home, and usually heading back home with some money and some gifts for the people who are in need. 4 examples. Now, if analyzed in conventional terms, where distributive dynamics are relegated to the background and productive labor radically separated from other sorts, we see 4 quite different sorts of activity. The window washer is vending a service. He is a self-employed member of the service industry. Some will perhaps see him as a micro-entrepreneur. The panhandler, in contrast, is unemployed, idle, and seeking charity. Pickpocket is a predator committing a crime, while the rural mother is performing a kinship role and invoking traditional morality. If instead we see these 4 figures as different forms of distributive labor, we are able to recover their